Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers, but from the children we raised with every ounce of love we had. For Linda Parker, the glossy wedding invitation slipped between unpaid bills wasn't just news of her son's big day, it was the first sign that she no longer had a place in his life. What followed was a painful unraveling of loyalty, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes for a mother to finally choose herself. Before we dive into her story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Hearing from people around the world makes these stories even more powerful and reminds us how connected we all are. I tore it open without thinking, expecting another advertisement for a real estate company, and instead found myself staring at thick, expensive paper that smelled faintly of perfume and money. Mr. and Mrs. David Parker request the honor of your presence. My eyes stumbled over the words once, twice, as if they might rearrange themselves into something softer, something that felt like family. But they didn't. It was my son's wedding announcement, and this was how I found out. No phone call. No coffee invitation. No tender conversation about the woman who had captured his heart. Just an official piece of cardstock, as though I were a distant relative they barely remembered but couldn't omit from the list. I stood there in my small kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, its gold lettering glimmering under the weak afternoon light. Around me, the clutter of unpaid bills and yesterday's dishes painted the truth of my life. I wasn't part of his world anymore. Not really. David was 28 now, working in technology, living in a sleek high-rise downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and valet parking. I had glimpsed it once, long ago, when he'd needed help moving boxes into his new place. It had felt like another planet, one I didn't have the right passport to enter. His fiancée, Rachel Whitman, had been polite the 2 times I met her at a brunch and on Christmas Eve. Polite, but careful, as if even my furniture might soil her just by proximity. I caught the way her eyes lingered on my old sofa, the way her manicured fingers hovered before touching anything. The wedding was set for June 15th at Magnolia Hill Country Club. Black tie optional, the card read. Optional, I almost laughed. My best dress was navy blue, bought on clearance 5 years ago for David's college graduation. It wasn't optional for me. It wasn't even possible. That night, I called him. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice distracted, distant, the way it always was when I interrupted his busy life. "Hey, Mom. I got the invitation," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Oh, good," he replied, as if we were discussing a delivery from the post office. No warmth, no excitement, just acknowledgement. "Congratulations, sweetheart," I added quickly. "Rachel looked beautiful in the photos you posted. I'd love to help with something. Maybe the flowers, or the cake tasting. You know, be part of it." There was a sharp pause, the kind that slices through a mother's hope. "Mom, everything's already handled. Rachel's parents are taking care of most of the arrangements." "I didn't mean financially," I said softly, twisting a pen between my fingers. "I just thought, maybe the mother-son dance? Helping you choose something? Just being included. We've chosen everything already." He cut me off. His sigh carried all the impatience of a man who felt burdened by the sound of his own mother. "Look, just show up, okay? It'll be nice, but don't overthink it. Rachel's family is pretty traditional, and I just want things to go smoothly." Traditional, nice. Words that sounded harmless, but wrapped tightly around me like chains. I swallowed the lump in my throat and kept my voice calm. "I understand. I don't want to embarrass you." "It's not that," he muttered, but his tone betrayed him. "Anyway, I have to go. Rachel's cooking dinner." And just like that, the line went dead. The only sound left was the faint hum of my refrigerator and the heavier silence pressing down on my chest. I looked at the invitation again, lying across the pile of overdue bills on the table. The words, "black tie optional," shimmered under the kitchen light, mocking me. Optional for them, impossible for me. That night, I made a decision. If I was going to be treated as a guest in my own son's life, then I would at least arrive with dignity. I would not let them see me diminished or small or apologetic. For 3 months, I saved every dollar I could. I skipped lunches, walked to work instead of taking the bus, canceled my cable subscription, clipped coupons until my hands ached. I counted pennies at the checkout line and told myself over and over, dignity is worth the sacrifice. By May, I had just enough. A new dress, emerald green, simple yet elegant, from a department store I'd never dared to enter before. Shoes that matched, with a soft silver buckle. And for the first time in over a decade, I sat in a salon chair and let a stylist curl my gray-streaked hair into something soft, something almost glamorous. When she spun me toward the mirror, I nearly didn't recognize the woman staring back. For a fleeting moment, I imagined David's eyes widening, his voice catching as he said, "Mom, you look beautiful." That fantasy was enough to carry me through the weeks that followed. Enough to let me believe that maybe, just maybe, showing up mattered. I spent the weeks after buying that emerald dress living in a strange in-between world. On one hand, there was the dull rhythm of my ordinary life, my small apartment with its squeaky radiator, my job processing insurance claims in a cramped cubicle with gray carpeting that always smelled faintly of mildew, the neighbors who barely knew my name. On the other hand, there was the looming spectacle of June 15th, shimmering like a lighthouse I was both drawn to and afraid of. Every time I brushed the dress hanging at the back of my closet, I felt a spark of hope and a stab of fear. Hope that it might change something. Fear that it would change nothing at all. I told myself the dress wasn't really for David. Not anymore. It was for me. Proof that I could step into any room, even one filled with crystal chandeliers and black tie tuxedos, and hold my head high. Still, when I pictured his eyes meeting mine across the crowd, I longed for some flicker of recognition. Just a moment where the little boy I raised might look past the polish of his new life and see his mother standing proud. Those weeks blurred into one long stretch of saving, denying, waiting. I skipped dinners out with coworkers, said no to the small indulgences that used to make the days tolerable. Every sacrifice became a brick in the foundation of my resolve. By the time the wedding week arrived, Savannah was draped in early summer heat, the kind that clung to your skin and wrapped itself around every breath. On June 14th, I laid everything out carefully. The emerald dress pressed and hanging by the door, the silver shoes waiting in their box, a small clutch borrowed from a friend. I even painted my nails, something I hadn't done in years, watching the glossy color dry with a mix of pride and nervousness. That night I barely slept. I lay awake imagining the country club, the polished marble floors, the rows of gleaming cars in the circular driveway. I imagined Rachel's family greeting me, David introducing me warmly, maybe even a dance later under the golden lights. My heart wanted so badly to believe in those images, even while my mind whispered that reality might not be so kind. On the morning of June 15th, I stood in front of the mirror and took a long breath. The woman looking back at me was not just a mother, not just an afterthought. She was someone who deserved to be seen. I slipped into the emerald dress, the fabric cool against my skin, and for the first time in a long while, I felt almost regal. I drove to the venue in my old Honda Civic, its 15 years of dents and scratches freshly scrubbed after a car wash the day before. It was no BMW, no Mercedes, but it was mine. Still, as I pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of Magnolia Hill Country Club, lined with rows of sleek, gleaming vehicles, my heart shrank a little. I parked near the edge of the lot, hoping no one would notice the odd car among the luxury models. The club itself was every bit as magnificent as I had imagined. Manicured lawns stretched in perfect lines, a shimmering lake reflected the bright June sky, and stone fountains trickled elegantly at the entrance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of roses and eucalyptus, cool against my flushed cheeks. A crystal chandelier hung high above the marble foyer, scattering light across polished floors. Guests floated through the space like pieces of a glossy magazine spread. Women in gowns that whispered luxury with every step. Men in tailored tuxedos with bow ties nodded just so. Their laughter echoed against the high-arched ceilings, a chorus of belonging I could not quite join. And then, across the room, I saw him. My son. David stood near the staircase, radiant in a black tuxedo, his hair styled to perfection, his smile wide as he laughed at something Charles Whitman had just said. Rachel was beside him, breathtaking in a gown that looked torn from the pages of a bridal magazine. Together, they were luminous, like the centerpieces of a world I no longer inhabited. My heart thudded as I walked toward them, each click of my silver shoes against the marble floor loud in my ears. His eyes met mine for a moment. Just a moment. And in that flash, I saw not warmth, not joy, but something that looked unsettlingly like fear. "Mom," he said evenly when I reached him, careful and measured. "You look so handsome," I said softly, reaching to adjust his bow tie the way I had done 100 times when he was little. For a second, my hand trembled in the air, reaching for a past that was already gone. He pulled back slightly, loosening the tie himself. "Thanks, Mom. You look nice." The word hung heavy. Nice. Not beautiful, not proud, just nice. Before I could reply, Charles Whitman extended a firm hand. "You must be David's mother, Charles Whitman." "Linda Parker," I answered, forcing a smile as I shook his hand. "Congratulations," I said quickly. He nodded politely, his smile rehearsed, before turning back to David. Within seconds, I had vanished from their attention, a background figure blurred in the corner of a perfect portrait. I stood there for a few minutes longer, the hum of conversation buzzing around me like static. Finally, I turned and drifted toward the reception hall. The space was dazzling, white tablecloths draped over round tables, crystal glasses gleaming, tall arrangements of roses stretching toward the chandeliers above. It was everything Rachel must have dreamed of, everything David had chosen instead of me. I searched for my place card and found it at table 8, tucked in the far corner near the swinging doors to the kitchen. My stomach tightened. Table 8 was not for family, or close friends, or even casual acquaintances. It was for leftovers, for people who had to be invited but didn't quite belong. I slid into the seat quietly. Around me were strangers, an older woman with a hearing aid, a nervous couple shifting in their formal clothes, and a few empty chairs that would never be filled. This was where they had placed me, out of sight, out of mind. As I sat there, adjusting the skirt of my dress, I told myself it didn't matter, that the important thing was being here, showing up, keeping my dignity intact. But each laugh that echoed from the front of the room chipped away at that fragile shield. Then, a kind voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Are you David's mother?" I turned to see a woman in her 60s, soft gray hair framing a kind face. She smiled gently, sliding into the seat beside me. "I'm Margaret Collins, Rachel's aunt. Do you mind if I sit here? I don't really know anyone else." Relief washed over me. "Of course," I said warmly. "I'm glad you did." She leaned closer, her eyes kind. "Everything is beautiful, isn't it? But it's not really my world either." I smiled faintly. "Mine neither." For a brief moment, I felt less alone. But as cocktail hour dragged on, my hope withered. David moved through the room like a seasoned politician, shaking hands, laughing, posing for photographs. He made time for everyone but me. Each minute that passed widened the hollow inside me until it felt as though the walls of that grand hall were pressing down on my chest. Dinner was announced, and the waiters moved with practiced precision, serving the main tables first. The Whitmans, David's college friends, Rachel's sorority sisters. Our table was last. Plates arrived one by one, until only I sat empty-handed. The waiter approached, flustered. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. There's been a mistake in the kitchen. Your meal will be right out." 20 minutes passed, then 30. Around me, plates were cleared, glasses refilled, laughter rising with every toast. Finally, a different server placed a dish in front of me. Cold salmon, limp asparagus, mashed potatoes scraped from the bottom of some forgotten pan. It looked like leftovers from another guest's plate. Margaret glanced at it, her face darkening. "That's unforgivable." I forced a smile. "It's fine. I'm just happy to be here." It was a lie. And as I picked at the cold food, the ache inside me deepened, a quiet crack that would soon split open into something irreversible. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with me. The clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation filled the reception hall. I sat at table 8, smiling politely at Margaret, while pushing the cold salmon around my plate. The food barely mattered anymore. What stung was the silence between me and my son. A silence louder than the music drifting from the string quartet in the corner. Then, I heard it. His voice. David had risen, glass in hand, preparing to give his thank you speech. His tall frame commanded attention, and the room fell into an expectant hush. He spoke about Rachel, about her family, about the sacrifices her parents had made to bring the day together. His words were polished, the kind that rolled easily off the tongue of someone used to impressing boardrooms and investors. But then he leaned slightly toward Rachel, speaking just loud enough for those nearest the head table to hear and just loud enough for me to catch it, too. "Well, look at that," he said with a smirk. "They finally got my mom's food out. She's used to eating whatever life leaves behind. She won't mind." The words hit me like a slap. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, that maybe my imagination was crueler than reality. But no, Rachel's laughter rang out, bright and sharp, followed by the chuckles of a few others within earshot. I froze, my fork trembling in my hand. Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "Did he just—" she whispered. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice even, though inside something fractured. It was a lie, of course, the kind I had told all my life. The kind mothers tell to keep the peace, to protect their children from shame, to absorb the blows so no one else has to. But this time, the lie tasted like ashes. I lowered my fork. My appetite was gone. What lingered instead was a cold clarity, like the moment before glass shatters. Dinner ended, and the music shifted. The DJ's voice boomed across the room, announcing the first dance. All eyes turned as David and Rachel floated onto the dance floor, moving gracefully to a love song that seemed to lift them above the rest of us. They were picture perfect, like a scene pulled from a film. I clapped politely, watching from my seat in the corner. Then came the father-daughter dance. Charles Whitman took Rachel's hand, twirling her with practiced ease, his face beaming with pride. Applause filled the hall. Next, the DJ announced the mother-son dance. My heart leapt. I smoothed my dress, my palms damp. This was it, the moment I had imagined for months, the moment I had rehearsed in my tiny apartment, swaying slowly to old songs on my phone. But David did not come for me. Instead, he turned to Rachel's mother, taking her hand with a smile, leading her onto the dance floor. The crowd cheered, cameras flashing. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Surely there had been a mistake. Surely he would come find me next. But the music played on, and I remained seated, invisible. The dance ended, and others spilled onto the floor, cousins, aunts, friends, all spinning under the golden lights. David never once looked my way. Margaret leaned close, her voice trembling. "Aren't you supposed to?" "No," I whispered. "Not tonight." And in that moment, the ache inside me crystallized into something solid, a truth I could no longer deny. I wasn't part of his world, not in the way that mattered. I had been invited to witness, not to belong. I stood slowly, smoothing the emerald dress that had once made me feel proud. It no longer mattered. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. No one noticed. Not David, not Rachel, not a single member of their polished, laughing circle. Outside, the night air wrapped around me, warm and heavy with the scent of magnolias. For the first time all evening, I breathed freely. When I got home, I hung the emerald dress carefully at the back of my closet. I changed into jeans and a faded t-shirt, the clothes that had always been my armor. Then I sat at the kitchen table, the glow of my laptop screen lighting the room. My fingers hovered over the keys, trembling with the weight of what I was about to do. I wasn't writing in anger. I wasn't even writing in grief. I was writing in clarity. "David," I began, "I write these words while your wedding is still fresh in my memory, though I suspect what I recall will differ greatly from what you choose to keep. Your remark about me being used to eating what life leaves behind was not just cruel, it was true. And in its truth, it gave me something I hadn't expected. Perspective." Line by line, I poured it out. How I had spent years accepting scraps of attention, of respect, of love, and taught him by example that it was acceptable to treat me that way. How I had worked overtime, skipped meals, delayed my own dreams, just to make sure he had his. How the monthly checks he thought came from a trust fund had actually come from my sacrifices. I told him it ended now. The financial support, the credit card in his name, the house he assumed would one day be his. All of it was finished. Not as punishment, not as revenge, but as the first time in decades I was choosing myself. I hit send at 3:47 the morning. No dramatic flourish, no hidden message, just the truth. By midday, his reply came. Mom, what the hell is this? Are you having a breakdown? You misunderstood everything. That joke wasn't about you. Everyone laughed, not just Rachel. You're being too sensitive. Selling the house is insane. That's my inheritance you're talking about. Dad would be rolling in his grave. Rachel says you're having a midlife crisis. She knows a therapist who could help. Let's talk Sunday. I'll come by. I didn't respond. By Friday, he was calling constantly. By Saturday, a shorter email arrived. Mom, I've been trying for 2 days. We need to talk about this house before you do something stupid. I spoke to a lawyer. You can't cut me out of my inheritance. Call me. I forwarded it to the realtor with a note. Please expedite the listing. By Tuesday, the house was on the market. By Thursday, I had 2 offers. By the weekend, I accepted one $115,000 above, asking, cash. The following Sunday, his final message appeared. Fine. You win. Whatever point you're trying to make, congratulations. You've destroyed our relationship and embarrassed me in front of Rachel's family. I hope it was worth it. I printed it out, slipped it into a folder labeled Proof, and set it aside. Not for court, not for anyone else, just for me, to remember. The closing date was set for July 20th. I placed a deposit on a furnished apartment in Savannah and booked a month-long stay at a bed and breakfast in Vermont for the fall. For the first time in 30 years, my calendar belonged to me. The woman who had raised David had done her job, and now, finally, she was free to live the life she had denied herself for so long. The day I handed over the keys, I didn't feel the grief I thought I would. My house had held 30 years of memories, birthdays with balloons taped to the walls, late-night arguments muffled by thin doors, the hollow silence that grew louder after David moved out. I thought I would cry. Instead, I felt strangely light, as if I had finally put down a suitcase I hadn't realized I was carrying. The buyer, a young couple expecting their first child, smiled as they walked through the front door, their faces glowing with the kind of hope I once had. I wished them well, then drove away without looking back. It wasn't my home anymore. Savannah greeted me with heat and the heavy scent of jasmine drifting from every porch. My new apartment was modest, a 1-bedroom tucked 4 blocks from the river, on a quiet street where neighbors nodded hello when they passed. The floors creaked, the windows stuck a little, but it was mine. Mine in a way the old house hadn't been for years. The first evening, I sat on the small balcony with a chipped mug of tea, listening to the hum of cicadas. Across the street, a family gathered on their porch swing, their laughter spilling into the night. I didn't feel envious. I felt ready. Ready to stop living in the shadow of someone else's story. A few days later, I wandered into a narrow bookstore tucked between a bakery and an antique shop. The air smelled of old paper and fresh coffee, a combination that felt like comfort itself. Behind the counter stood a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun. You look like someone who knows books aren't just merchandise, she said after we exchanged pleasantries. Her name was Susan Miller, the owner. 10 minutes of conversation later, she offered me a part-time job. The work wasn't glamorous, stacking shelves, ringing up customers, dusting displays, but every day I was surrounded by stories. And in those stories, I began to rediscover pieces of myself. Characters who had suffered and rebuilt. Journeys that ended not in triumph, but in quiet dignity. Evenings became my sanctuary. I walked along the river, watching the sunset bleed across the water. I bought simple meals, fresh bread, fruit, the occasional bowl of gumbo from a corner cafe, and savored them slowly. Not rushing, not apologizing. At a yard sale, I found an old porch swing for $20, its paint peeling but sturdy. I hauled it up to my balcony and painted it soft blue. There, I spent hours reading, writing in a notebook, or simply listening to the world move around me. For the first time in decades, I was not rushing to fix, to provide, to anticipate someone else's need. My life shrank, yes, but it also deepened. 3 months passed without a word from David. No calls, no letters, not even a text. The silence might have once felt unbearable, but now it was a kind of gift. In its space, I could hear my own thoughts again. One Thursday afternoon in October, Susan slipped me a note behind the counter. "A man called, said he was your son." He sounded desperate. I folded the paper, tucking it into my pocket. That evening, I stood by my balcony swing, the cicadas droning their endless chorus. My chest ached, but not with the old weight of expectation. It was something different, a mix of sadness and strength. 2 days later, he appeared in person. David looked smaller than I remembered, his tailored suit rumpled, dark circles carved beneath his eyes. He hesitated at the bookstore door before spotting me shelving novels in the back. His voice cracked when he spoke my name. "Mom, please, can we talk?" For a moment, the little boy in him flickered through. The boy who used to run down the hallway in dinosaur pajamas, clutching a toy car. The boy I once believed would never forget me. But the man standing before me was not that boy. He was someone who had taken for granted the hands that fed him, the sacrifices that shaped his path. And I was not the same woman either. "I finish at 6, I told him, my voice steady. "There's a cafe next door. You'll have an hour." That night, we sat across from each other at a small table, coffee cups between us. His apologies tumbled out, rehearsed but fragile. He said he missed me, that he missed having a mother who believed in him. I listened, but I didn't bend. "I did believe in you," I said. "But love without boundaries isn't love, David. It's permission. And I can't keep giving you permission to hurt me." The words surprised even me. They came not from anger, but from clarity. For the first time, I was no longer begging to be seen. I was simply stating the truth. When I left the cafe, the savannah air wrapped around me, warm and heavy, carrying the faint scent of magnolias. I didn't look back. I had spent 30 years eating the leftovers of other people's lives. Now I was setting my own table. The cafe next door to the bookstore was quiet that evening, the kind of place where conversations sank into the hum of soft jazz and the clink of spoons against porcelain. I chose a small table by the window, its surface worn smooth from years of use. When David walked in, his eyes scanned the room quickly until they landed on me. He looked both relieved and hesitant, like a man approaching a locked door without knowing if he had the right key. He sat down across from me, his suit jacket wrinkled, tie loosened, the polish of his wedding day long gone. For a moment, we just stared at each other, mother and son, divided by more than a table. "I've been calling you," he said finally, his voice rough. "I know," I replied. "Why didn't you answer?" "Because there wasn't anything left to say that I hadn't already written." He flinched, as though my calmness hurt more than anger would have. He rubbed his palms together, searching for the right words. "Mom, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. That night, the joke, the dance, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was just caught up in everything. You know how weddings are." I held his gaze. "Weddings don't erase respect, David. Respect should never be optional." He dropped his eyes, staring at the table. For a while, the only sound was the faint music drifting from the speakers. "I miss you," he whispered. "I miss knowing there's someone who always believes in me." The words twisted inside me, tugging at the old instinct to comfort, to reassure. But I had learned the cost of that reflex. "I did believe in you," I said gently. "I still do, in some ways. But belief without boundaries isn't love. It's permission. And I can't keep giving you permission to treat me like I don't matter." He swallowed hard. "So what now? You're just done with me?" "No," I answered softly. "You'll always be my son. But being my son doesn't give you the right to take from me without giving anything back. I'm not your safety net anymore. I'm not the woman who sacrifices everything so you can live untouched. That season of my life is over." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw not the confident man in a tailored suit, but the boy who once cried when he lost a toy car. Vulnerability flickered in his eyes, but behind it was confusion, the realization that the rules had changed, and he didn't know how to play by them. "Rachel doesn't understand why you're doing this," he said. "She thinks you've changed." "I have," I admitted. "And for once, the change is for me." We sat in silence after that, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm. I could feel the weight of his words pressing against me, but I didn't yield. There was no anger left, only clarity. When the clock on the wall chimed 7, I stood. "I told you I had an hour. The hour's over." He blinked at me, startled. "That's it? You're just going to walk away?" "Yes," I said simply. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm not walking away from myself." I placed a few dollars on the table for my coffee and stepped toward the door. The bell above it chimed softly as I pushed it open. Outside, the Savannah evening wrapped around me like a heavy quilt, warm and fragrant with magnolias. Behind me, I could still hear David calling, "Mom, wait!" But I didn't. I walked down the brick-lined street, past the glow of shop windows and the laughter spilling from a nearby restaurant. For the first time in decades, I wasn't defined by who waited for me at home, or what someone else needed. I was simply Linda Parker, a woman with her own story to write. At the corner, I paused, closing my eyes against the night breeze. The cicadas sang their endless song, and I felt something in me finally settle. I had spent years accepting the leftovers of love, of attention, of dignity. That chapter was over. Now, at last, I was setting my own table. Savannah had a way of softening the edges of my days. Maybe it was the way the moss-draped oaks lined the streets like quiet guardians, or the way the air smelled faintly of salt and jasmine even in the heat. Whatever it was, I felt it working on me, little by little, as though the city itself was whispering, "You can rest now." The bookstore quickly became my refuge. Susan Miller, the owner, treated me less like an employee and more like a friend. She had a dry humor and an easy honesty that made every shift feel less like work and more like belonging. On my second week, she told me, "You know, Linda, people don't come in here just for books. They come for a piece of quiet in a noisy world, and you give them that." Her words sank deep. For so long, I had been invisible in my own life, dismissed as background to someone else's story. Here, strangers walked in, and I greeted them with warmth, and for a moment, they saw me. I mattered. I learned the rhythms of the shop, the morning rush of retirees picking up newspapers, the afternoon trickle of students looking for secondhand novels, the evening regulars who came just to talk. Some told me about their grandchildren, others about the books they'd read as children. Their stories, ordinary and unpolished, wove into mine, and slowly I began to feel stitched back together. Evenings were my own. I'd walk along the river, watching the light ripple across the water as the sun sank low. Sometimes I'd stop at a cafe and order something simple, a bowl of soup, a piece of cornbread, and savor it slowly, no longer gulping meals between responsibilities. At home, the little apartment felt warm, not empty. I filled it with second-hand treasures, a lamp with a chipped base, a faded quilt from the flea market, and the porch swing I had painted soft blue. It squeaked a little, but to me, it sang. I began writing again. Not emails of confrontation, but pages of reflection. Stories about women who had given too much and finally chose themselves. I didn't know if anyone would read them, but it didn't matter. The act of writing felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that I had abandoned. Susan noticed one afternoon when she found me scribbling during my lunch break. "You're a writer," she said simply. I laughed. "I'm a woman with a notebook." "Same thing," she replied, and walked away. Her confidence in me startled something awake. For years, my words had been swallowed by work, by sacrifice, by silence. Now, on paper, they found space to breathe. But it wasn't only writing. Savannah drew me outward, too. At Susan's suggestion, I joined a Saturday morning reading circle. At first, I hesitated, convinced I'd sit quietly on the edges, but the group welcomed me like an old friend. We sat in a circle of worn chairs, sharing passages from books that had carried us through difficult times. When it was my turn, I read a line about forgiveness, and my voice trembled. No one mocked me. They just nodded, as if they knew. It was in those moments among people who had no stake in my past that I realized healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in listening, in being listened to, in small rooms with mismatched chairs where your story is safe. I started taking walks through Forsyth Park on Sundays, sketching the fountain in a little pad I bought for $2. My drawings were clumsy, but each line felt like a step toward joy. I even signed up for a beginner's art class at the community center. Sitting among strangers with charcoal smudges on my fingers, I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't known in years. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no word from David. At first, the silence was sharp, like a wound. But as the days passed, it dulled. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping. The quiet no longer meant abandonment. It meant space. One evening in late October, I sat on my swing with a cup of tea, the night air cool, the stars scattered above like tiny lanterns. For the first time, I realized I wasn't replaying the wedding in my head. I wasn't hearing his words echo, wasn't picturing the empty dance floor. Instead, I was here in this moment, in this city, in this life I was building with my own two hands. The woman I had been would never have believed it possible. But the woman I was becoming knew. It was not only possible, it was necessary. I had spent so long as a supporting character in someone else's story. Now, slowly, page by page, I was writing my own. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. By November, Savannah felt less like a place I had moved to and more like a place I belonged. The bookstore, the reading circle, the evening walks by the river, they had become my anchors. Steady and quiet. My days carried a rhythm I hadn't known in years. A rhythm not dictated by someone else's needs. One crisp morning, Susan handed me a small envelope that had been slipped under the shop's front door. "Looks like it's for you," she said, raising an eyebrow. The handwriting on the envelope was neat, unfamiliar. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a card, simple and white. The message was short. "Mrs. Parker, I want to say I'm sorry. For how I treated you, for the way I judged you. You deserved better than the coldness I showed. I hope one day you might forgive me. Rachel." I stood still, the words blurring as my eyes stung. Rachel, the woman who had looked around my living room with disdain, the one who had laughed at my expense during the reception, the one who had made me feel like an outsider in my own son's story. And yet here was her apology, unexpected and strangely tender. I tucked the card into my pocket, unsure of how to feel. Forgiveness was a word I had turned over often in my mind these past months. It wasn't about excusing, I had learned. It was about letting go of the weight. Still, I wasn't ready to reply. Not yet. That evening, I sat on my balcony swing, card in my lap, tea cooling beside me. The cicadas were quiet now, replaced by the rustle of autumn leaves. I thought about Rachel writing those words, about what it must have cost her pride to admit them. I also thought about David, whether he knew, whether he cared, whether he was still angry. 2 nights later, I got my answer. It was close to closing time at the bookstore when I saw him outside, pacing on the sidewalk. His figure was thinner, sharper, shadows etched beneath his eyes. When I stepped out, he looked up quickly, as though afraid I might vanish if he blinked. "Mom," he said, breathless. "Please, just hear me out." I crossed my arms, steady. "I gave you an hour once. You remember that." "I know," he said, voice cracking. "And I wasted it. I was angry, defensive. But things are different now. Rachel, she keeps talking about you, about how she was wrong. She wants to meet you, to try again. And I want that too." The sincerity in his tone startled me, but I kept my guard. "Why now?" He looked down, shoulders slumping. "Because I thought cutting you off would make it easier. I thought if I ignored the guilt, it would disappear. But it hasn't. It's worse." I keep hearing your words that night in the cafe. About permission, about respect, and I realized you were right. The old reflex, the urge to comfort him, to pull him into an embrace, rose in me like muscle memory. But I stayed still. I don't know if I believe you, I said quietly. Not yet. Words are easy. Living differently is harder. He nodded, eyes glistening. Then, let me prove it. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but let me try. Please. I didn't answer right away. The street was quiet, the lamps glowing warm against the brick. Finally, I said, I'll think about it. His relief was visible, like a man who had been holding his breath too long. That's all I ask. That night, lying in bed, I turned Rachel's card over and over in my hand. For months, I had lived as though the door to my past was closed. Now, for the first time, I wondered if it was possible to leave it cracked open, not wide enough to step back through, but just enough for light to filter in. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean returning to the way things had been. But maybe, just maybe, it could mean loosening the grip of bitterness, choosing peace over poison. I placed the card on my nightstand, next to the small lamp I had found at the flea market. Its glow filled the room with a gentle light. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel like a woman defined by what she had lost. I felt like a woman standing on the edge of something new, fragile, uncertain, but possible. When I finally agreed to meet David and Rachel, I chose the place myself. Not the grand dining rooms they were accustomed to, not a country club where I would always feel out of place. I invited them to a small cafe near the river, the kind of spot where the tables were mismatched and the coffee was served in chipped mugs, but the air carried the warmth of home. I arrived early, as I always did. My nerves wrapped tight. I sat at a corner table. The window cracked just enough to let in the scent of the river breeze. My hands cupped around the mug. I told myself that I wasn't here to be convinced. I was here to listen. There was a difference. They walked in together, and for a moment I saw them not as the polished couple from the wedding photos, but as two people carrying something heavy. David's shoulders slumped as if under a weight he couldn't put down. Rachel's eyes were softer than I remembered, without the sharpness of judgment I'd felt in my living room months ago. Mom, David said, hesitant, as they reached the table. Linda, Rachel added quietly, almost as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to use my name. We sat. The silence stretched, awkward and fragile, before Rachel spoke first. Thank you for meeting us. I know I don't deserve your time, but I wanted to say in person what I wrote. I was wrong. The way I looked at you, the way I laughed when I should have stood up for you, it was cruel. I'm ashamed of it. Her voice trembled, and for a moment I saw not the polished bride but a young woman terrified of rejection. I nodded slowly. It hurt. More than you probably know. But I hear you. David leaned forward, his hands clasped. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that I see it now the way I treated you, the way I let Rachel's world matter more than my own blood. I'm sorry. I studied him carefully. His words weren't rehearsed this time. His eyes didn't dart away. They stayed on me, steady, even when mine filled with tears. I don't want apologies, I said softly. I want respect. I want you to remember that I am more than the woman who sacrificed so you could stand where you are. I want to be seen, David. Not as an obligation, not as a guest at the edge of your life, but as your mother, a person with dignity. His face crumpled, and for a moment, the man vanished and the little boy returned. The one who used to run to me after falling off his bike, needing only my arms to feel safe again. You're right, he whispered, and I don't know how to undo what I've done. You can't, I said simply, but you can choose differently from here on. The rest of the conversation unfolded gently, without theatrics. Rachel asked about my job at the bookstore, surprised when I described the joy I felt stacking shelves and talking with strangers. David asked about my apartment, and I told him about the swing on the balcony where I read at night. For the first time in years, our talk wasn't about what I could provide or what I was failing to do. It was simply conversation, human to human. When the hour ended, I walked with them to the river. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the water shimmering with light. We stood together, not as a perfect family, Not as strangers, but something in between. Rachel turned to me then, her voice barely above a whisper. Would it be all right if we tried again? Not to erase the past, but to start something new? I looked at her, at David, at the river flowing endlessly beside us. My heart was cautious, but it wasn't closed. We can try, I said. But trying means listening, respecting, meeting each other where we are, not where we wish we were. David nodded quickly, almost desperately. Yes, that's what I want. We parted with a tentative hug, awkward but real. As I watched them walk away, I knew nothing was guaranteed. But I also knew that for the first time, I wasn't walking away feeling small. I was walking away as a woman who had set her boundaries and been heard. That night, sitting on my balcony swing, I wrote in my notebook, "Forgiveness is not a door flung wide open. It's a window cracked just enough for the air to change." For the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, the air really could. The weeks after that meeting with David and Rachel felt lighter. Not because everything was healed, but because I had finally drawn the line where I needed it most. They had stepped toward me, cautiously, and I had allowed just enough space for them to try. But I didn't sit by the phone waiting. I didn't hold my breath for the next apology. Instead, I turned deeper toward the life I was building in Savannah. Susan was the first to notice. "You walk differently now," she told me one morning as I shelved a stack of novels. "Like someone who knows she belongs." Her words carried me through the day. Belonging had been foreign for so long, a luxury I thought was reserved for people who lived in big houses and had names printed in gold on wedding invitations. But now, in this little bookstore on a quiet street, belonging was mine. I took her encouragement to heart and signed up for a painting class at the community center. Walking into that room for the first time, I felt the old nerves tug at me, the fear of standing out, of not being good enough. But the instructor, a woman with paint smudged on her cheeks and a laugh that filled the room, quickly erased the tension. We painted bowls of fruit and city skylines, clumsy at first, then slowly, more confident. My brushstrokes weren't perfect, but each one felt like a declaration. I am here, I am trying. Sitting at that easel, surrounded by strangers who became friends, I found a kind of joy I hadn't expected. Soon, my evenings filled with more than just the bookstore or quiet walks. I joined a tea circle that met every other Sunday, a group of women who brought different blends to share. We sat around a long wooden table, sipping from mismatched cups, telling stories about our lives. Some were widows, some divorced, some simply seeking company. I didn't feel like the odd one out anymore. I felt like part of a tapestry, woven together by laughter and shared vulnerability. One evening, as the group was dispersing, a woman named Joanne squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said. "You remind me that it's never too late to start over." Her words echoed in my heart long after I walked home. Never too late. That was becoming the rhythm of my days, the chorus behind every new step I took. Back at my apartment, I hung my paintings on the wall, uneven but proud. I brewed chamomile tea and sat on the swing, looking out at the lights twinkling across the river. The loneliness that used to gnaw at me felt softer now, replaced by something else, contentment. It wasn't that I had forgotten the past. The scars were still there, tender in certain moments. A song on the radio, a wedding photo shared online, a memory of a little boy running barefoot through the yard that could still pull tears from me. But those tears no longer drowned me. They watered something new. David sent the occasional message now, small and careful. Updates about work, a photo of a dinner he and Rachel had cooked together, a question about a recipe I used to make. I replied sometimes, not always, and I didn't feel guilty about the times I chose silence. It was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about keeping myself whole. Savannah itself became a companion. The cobblestone streets, the sound of horse-drawn carriages, the way the Spanish moss swayed like lace in the wind, all of it reminded me that beauty could live alongside sorrow, that life could be rebuilt not in spite of brokenness, but because of it. One Saturday, as I packed up books after a busy day at the store, Susan leaned against the counter. "You know," she said, "you've got a gift for bringing people together. Have you ever thought about starting something of your own? A little club, a circle? A space where people can come just as they are?" Her words stirred something deep inside me. I had been the guest at the edge of a wedding, unseen and unwanted. But what if, here in Savannah, I could create a space where no one ever felt that way again? That night, I wrote in my notebook, not a dream of escape, but a dream of building, a place where dignity is assumed, not earned. The idea settled in my heart like a seed, waiting for the right moment to grow. And as I sat on the swing, the river breeze lifting the pages, I realized something simple and profound. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The idea of creating something of my own stayed with me like a quiet hum, impossible to ignore. I carried it with me at the bookstore, while shelving novels or ringing up customers. I carried it on my evening walks, where the scent of magnolias drifted through the air like a promise. I carried it on my balcony swing, scribbling late into the night. At first, I told myself it was silly. I was nearly 60, with no money to spare beyond rent and groceries. Who was I to dream of starting anything new? But the more I tried to dismiss it, the louder it grew. It wasn't about grandeur, it wasn't about status. It was about building a table where no one was left at the corner, where no one had to eat scraps of dignity. One morning, I shared the thought with Susan as we opened the bookstore. What if there were a place, I began hesitantly, where people could come just to feel welcome, to share stories, to paint, to drink tea together. Nothing fancy, just belonging. She looked at me, her eyes kind but serious. Linda, that's not silly. That's necessary. And I think you're exactly the person to do it. Her certainty startled me, but it also gave me courage. I started small. I asked around at the community center, checked the church bulletin boards, even posted a handwritten flyer at the grocery store, looking for a space to gather, for anyone who needs company, stories, or simply a quiet corner to be themselves. Contact Linda. I expected silence. Instead, within a week, I had a handful of replies. A retired teacher who missed her students, a widower who said his house was too quiet, a young mother who wanted adult conversation. They didn't know one another, but they all wanted the same thing: connection. The problem was space. My apartment was too small, and renting a hall was out of reach. For a while, I thought the dream would end before it began. Then, one afternoon, Susan unlocked the door to the dusty storage room behind the bookstore. "Take a look," she said. "It's nothing glamorous, but it's yours if you want it." The room was small, cluttered with boxes and forgotten shelves. The floorboards creaked, the paint peeled, and the single window stuck halfway open. But as I stood there, I didn't see dust. I saw possibility. With Susan's blessing, I began cleaning. I hauled boxes, scrubbed the floor, washed the window until light streamed in. On weekends, I found mismatched chairs at thrift stores, a long wooden table at a yard sale, a rug that smelled faintly of lavender after a good beating in the sun. Piece by piece, the space began to change. The first gathering was modest. 6 people sat around the table, sipping tea I brewed in a dented kettle, passing around homemade cookies from one of the women. We introduced ourselves, awkward at first. Then slowly, stories began to spill out. About childhood summers, about losses carried quietly, about little joys that had no audience until now. I named the space the Haven. It felt right, a small refuge. Nothing grand, but enough. Word spread slowly but steadily. People stopped by after the bookstore closed, curious. Some stayed, some didn't, but those who did kept coming back. They brought knitting needles, journals, photographs. One man read aloud from a letter his wife had written before she passed. Another woman shared a poem she had never dared to show anyone. We laughed. We cried. We listened. I realized then that healing didn't always come from fixing what was broken. Sometimes it came from knowing you weren't alone in your breaking. At night, after everyone left, I'd linger in the quiet room, the chairs pushed back, the kettle cooling. I'd run my hand across the worn wood of the table and whisper, "This is what dignity looks like. Not wealth, not perfection, but presence." I thought about David and Rachel sometimes, about whether they'd ever step through that door. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, The Haven was not built to prove anything to them. It was built to prove something to myself, that I could create a life that was more than leftovers. One evening, as I turned off the lights, Susan caught me smiling. "You know," she said, "you've built something beautiful here." And for the first time in years, I believed her. The Haven had been open for nearly 2 months when I saw David and Rachel standing in the doorway. It was a Wednesday evening, and the room was alive with gentle conversation. 10 of us sat around the wooden table, teacups scattered beside notebooks and half-finished knitting projects. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and cinnamon cookies. At first, I thought my eyes were tricking me. I blinked, and there they were, David shifting nervously in his jacket, Rachel holding a casserole dish as if it were a peace offering. The room quieted for a moment, every head turning toward the unfamiliar pair. "Hi," Rachel said softly. "We didn't mean to intrude. We heard about this place, and we wanted to see it." I felt my chest tighten, the old reflex rising, the instinct to protect myself. But I stood, steady. "You're welcome here," I said, my voice calm. "This is the Haven. Anyone looking for connection has a seat." They joined us at the table, sliding into 2 empty chairs. Rachel set the casserole down in the center, her hands trembling slightly. "It's just baked ziti," she murmured. I thought maybe I could bring something. A woman named Joanne, who had become a regular, broke the tension with a warm smile. "Looks delicious. Pass me a plate." And just like that, the air softened again. The others returned to their stories, a memory from childhood, a poem about grief, a laugh about a grandchild's antics. David and Rachel listened at first, hesitant, but slowly leaned in. When it was David's turn, he cleared his throat. "I'm not sure what to share," he admitted, "but I guess I'll say this. I thought success meant never looking back. I thought the only way forward was to outgrow where I came from. But I see now that in the process, I forgot the person who gave me the ground to stand on. My mom." All eyes turned toward me. My face burned, but I kept my voice steady. "David, this space isn't about guilt. It's about honesty. If that's yours, then thank you for sharing it." Rachel spoke next, her voice quiet. "I judged you," she said, looking directly at me. "I thought I was better because of money, because of appearances. But I was wrong. This place, it's real. And I see now how much I missed by not knowing you sooner." The group murmured gently, some nodding, others sipping tea. There was no judgment, only presence. I realized then that the Haven had become something larger than I had ever intended. It wasn't just a room with mismatched chairs. It was a mirror, a place where truths could be spoken without breaking the speaker. After the gathering ended and the others drifted out into the cool night, David and Rachel lingered. Rachel gathered her dish, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for letting us come," she said. "We'd like to return, if that's all right." I nodded. "This door stays open, but respect is the only requirement." David swallowed, his voice low. "I'll earn it, Mom. One day at a time." When they left, the room was quiet again. I stacked the cups, folded the tablecloth, and stood for a moment in the glow of the single lamp. My heart ached, but not with the old familiar pain. It ached with something new, the fragile hope that maybe, in this space I had built for myself, there was room for them too. That night, on my balcony swing, I wrote in my notebook, "Forgiveness doesn't always arrive like a flood. Sometimes it trickles in like a stream, slow but steady, carving out new places where life can grow." And for the first time, I didn't just believe it, I felt it. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. When Ellie left Savannah after her weekend stay, I thought the silence would echo too loudly in my home. Instead, it hummed with warmth, like a song that lingered after the choir had stopped singing. Her laughter was still in the walls, her small hands still in the dough bowl on the counter, and for the first time in years, I felt that my house carried not absence but presence. That feeling gave me courage to begin something new. For months, I had toyed with the idea of creating a small community space, a place where older folks like me, and even the younger ones looking for belonging, could gather. It wasn't about running a program or proving anything. It was simply about making room for stories, for healing, for cups of tea poured slowly and conversations that didn't have to rush. I called it The Haven. Not a grand name, but a true one. Franklin used to say that home wasn't where you closed the door, but where your soul could finally rest. That's what I wanted to build, not another house, but a resting place of the heart. The first Saturday I opened the doors, I placed a circle of mismatched chairs in the living room, a quilt draped across one, a rocking chair in the corner, folding chairs borrowed from neighbors. In the center, I set a small wooden table with a candle, a vase of wildflowers, and a stack of blank note cards. I wasn't sure who would come, if anyone. But I told myself that even if it was just me, it would still matter. By 10 o'clock, the bell above the door rang softly. Mrs. Adler from down the street shuffled in with her knitting bag, her eyes curious. Behind her came Jamal, a young man who worked at the grocery store, carrying a notebook tucked under his arm. One by one, more faces appeared, people I had passed on walks, waved to at the market, or barely knew at all. And somehow, we filled the room. We didn't have an agenda. Instead, I invited them to write a word on the cards, something they wanted to release, or something they longed to welcome. Some read aloud. Some just folded their cards and placed them under the candle. A woman named Ruth whispered about losing her husband last winter. Jamal read a poem he had scribbled in the margins of his grocery lists. Mrs. Adler knitted silently, the rhythm of her needles speaking enough. I sat back, listening, marveling at the simple truth. Healing didn't always roar. Sometimes it sighed. That night, I wrote a letter to Ellie. I told her about the Haven, about how her visit had given me the spark to finally open the doors. You made me brave, I wrote. Your laughter planted seeds, and today they bloomed. A week later, her reply came in the mail. The envelope was covered in stickers of sunflowers. Grandma, she wrote in her looping handwriting, I wish I could be there every Saturday. Promise me you'll keep it going until I can visit again. I pressed her letter to my heart. The Haven wasn't just for the neighbors. It was a bridge across miles, something Ellie could feel too. Then, one evening, another letter arrived, this time from Daniel, my son. I stared at his handwriting for a long while before opening it. His words were hesitant, careful. Mom, Tina told me about Ellie's weekend with you. She hasn't stopped talking about it. I wanted you to know I'm glad. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to say that. I guess I didn't realize how much we all needed this kind of connection. I hope the Haven brings you joy. Maybe one day we can come down and see it for ourselves. Tears blurred the page. Daniel had always been the quiet one, the dutiful son who thought silence equaled peace. For years, his silence had wounded me more than words could. And now, in this simple letter, I felt the door creak open just a little. I sat at my desk that night with two letters before me, Ellie's bright sunflowers and Daniel's quiet olive branch. I realized something I hadn't before. The Haven wasn't only about opening space for others, it was about opening space inside myself, a place wide enough to hold grief and love together. The weeks turned into months, and the Haven became a steady rhythm. We painted watercolors on rainy days, shared soup recipes on cold nights, even sang hymns when the spirit moved us. Sometimes, the stories were heavy, like stones carried too long. Other times, they were light as feathers, reminding us that joy didn't need an excuse. And in the middle of it all, I found myself smiling in ways I hadn't in years. Not because everything was fixed or perfect, but because, for the first time, I wasn't living as though my worth depended on being needed. I was living because I was loved, simply and quietly, just as I was. Summer in Savannah has its own rhythm, slower than spring, softer than autumn. The mornings begin with cicadas singing before the sun even rises high, and the evenings carry the scent of magnolias mixed with salt from the river breeze. This summer was unlike any other I had known in years, because Ellie was coming to stay with me for 2 whole weeks. When her parents dropped her off at the station, she ran into my arms with that youthful energy that only children have, as if the world itself was opening wide just for her. Having Ellie and Savannah changed the air inside my house. Her laughter filled the rooms, her drawings scattered across the dining table, her shoes left by the porch. It wasn't chaos, it was life. She helped me water the flowers in the mornings, and every day she insisted on coming with me to the haven. At first, she sat quietly, watching the older ladies knit or the men sip coffee slowly. But before long, she was walking around the room with her sketchbook, asking if she could draw people's portraits. The haven, which had always been a circle of shared silence and soft stories, suddenly had bursts of childlike wonder. I watched her sit with Mrs. Green, a widow who rarely spoke, and gently ask, "Can I draw your hands?" Mrs. Green laughed for the first time in months, holding out her wrinkled fingers like a queen presenting jewels. Ellie's presence didn't just brighten the room, it healed something unspoken. People began to bring small gifts for her, seashells, colored pencils, homemade cookies. They said it was because she made them feel young again. But I knew it was more than that. She carried the kind of love that wasn't heavy, the kind that didn't demand anything, it simply gave. One evening, after a long day of activities, we sat on the porch sipping lemonade. Ellie looked at me and said, "Grandma, I think people come to the haven because it feels like home. Not the kind of home with walls, but the kind where your heart doesn't have to hide." Her words struck me deeper than any adult wisdom I'd heard in years. Toward the end of her stay, Daniel and Tina arrived. I wasn't sure how it would feel to have them in my Savannah world, a space I had built after so much pain. Yet when they stepped into the haven and saw Ellie handing out cups of iced tea to the group, something in their faces softened. Daniel walked slowly, reading the notes on the community board, while Tina sat in the back, her eyes glistening as she watched her daughter laughing with strangers who had become family to me. That night, over a simple dinner of shrimp and grits, the conversation was calm. Not forced, not defensive. For the first time in years, it felt like we were sitting together as human beings, not as adversaries bound by unspoken disappointments. Tina didn't speak much, but before they left, she slipped an envelope onto the kitchen counter. After they drove away, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, shaky but sincere. She wrote about her regrets, about the blind pride that had kept her from reaching out sooner, about the gratitude she now felt for the love I gave Ellie so freely. She ended with, "I don't know how to ask for forgiveness, but I hope you know I am thankful. More than words can say." I sat at the kitchen table, letter trembling in my hands. Forgiveness had always felt like a distant horizon, something I wanted to offer, but didn't know if I could. Yet reading her words, I realized forgiveness was already here. It had been blooming quietly, in Ellie's laughter, in Daniel's softened eyes, in Tina's unspoken tears. That night, as Ellie curled up in bed, I stood by the window and looked out at the magnolia trees swaying under the moonlight. For years, I had prayed for healing, thinking it meant restoring what was broken in the past. But now I understood. Healing was not about going back, it was about building forward. Savannah had given me that. The haven had become a sanctuary not just for me, but for everyone who entered. And Ellie, with her summer sketches and her fearless love, had become the bridge between the old wounds and the new life. When the 2 weeks ended, I hugged her tightly at the station, whispering, "You've given me more than you'll ever know." She pulled back, smiling with the wisdom of a child, and said, "No, Grandma, you already had it. I just helped you see." As the train carried her away, I felt no emptiness, only fullness. For the first time in decades, I could say without hesitation, I was happy. Not just healing, not just surviving. Truly, deeply happy. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my door by the mailman who always tipped his cap and left before I could reach him. I thought it was another folded flyer, some neighborhood announcement about yard sales or garden clubs. But when I picked it up, the envelope was heavier, embossed with the seal of the city. Inside was an invitation. They wanted me. A woman who once thought her voice belonged only in whispered prayers and in recipes, passed down through the family to speak at the annual Community Renewal Conference in Savannah. The note said, "We've heard of the haven, of what you have built, and of the healing that flows from your story. Would you share it with us?" For a long moment, I simply sat at my kitchen table, the sunlight spilling across the wood, letter trembling in my hands. My first thought was, No, not me. Surely they mean someone else. But as I read it again, a strange calm settled in. This wasn't about being an expert. It was about being real. The day of the conference arrived quicker than I expected. The hall was vast, rows of chairs filled with strangers whose eyes carried their own untold burdens. My knees quivered as I stood at the edge of the stage, clutching the small stack of notes I had written. But when the moderator called my name, something in me straightened. I thought of Franklin, of Sophie, of Ellie, of all the people who had sat in the circle at the Haven. This wasn't about performance. It was about presence. I stepped to the microphone, and the hush in the room felt like a hand guiding me forward. I am not a woman of great titles, I began, my voice softer than I intended, yet steady. I am a mother, a grandmother, and for a time, I was someone who believed love meant giving until I disappeared. Faces lifted, eyes widened, as if those words unlocked something they themselves had buried. I spoke of the years of silence, of the sting of being excluded from the very table I had sacrificed to set. I told them how shame had wrapped around me like a cloak until I could hardly see myself. And then I told them of the night I chose to begin again, not with anger, but with a small apartment, a teapot, and the decision to live as if I were still worthy of joy. I spoke of Ellie's laughter in Savannah, of Sophie's hesitant steps toward reconciliation, of Tina's trembling apology written in ink that smudged with tears. I told them of the Haven, how strangers had become companions, how healing had come not through grand gestures but through cups of tea, shared bread, and the courage to listen. As I spoke, I noticed heads nodding, shoulders loosening, hands dabbing at eyes. I realized my story was no longer just mine. It was a mirror for many. At one point, I paused, because the lump in my throat felt too heavy. But then I remembered something Franklin used to say whenever I doubted myself. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. So I stood. I want you to know, I said finally, that it is never too late to be what you might have been. I thought my years of becoming were behind me, but they weren't. They still aren't, and neither are yours. The words left me trembling. But when the hall filled with a silence so deep it felt sacred, I knew they had landed where they were meant to. When I stepped down from the stage, people came forward not to praise, but to connect. A woman pressed my hands and whispered, "That's my story too." A young man with tired eyes said, "I needed to hear that from my mother." For the first time, I understood. My pain had not been wasted. It had been transformed. That night, back in my quiet home, I lit a candle on the windowsill, not for sorrow but for gratitude. The flame flickered like a heartbeat against the glass, steady, alive. I realized then, this was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. Not the kind written in wills or carved into stone, but the legacy of showing others that healing is possible, that forgiveness has a face, and that love when reclaimed is the strongest inheritance we can give. The morning of my final chapter came quietly, as if life itself wanted me to notice the softness of its arrival. I walked into the garden behind my home, where the roses Franklin once planted had begun to bloom again. Their petals caught the early light, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a certainty inside me not about what I had lost, but about what I had found. This journey had never been about winning battles or proving who was wrong. It was about remembering who I was beyond the disappointments, beyond the betrayals, beyond the silence I once carried in my chest. Standing there among the blossoms, I whispered a truth I had waited too many years to say aloud. I forgive. Forgiveness wasn't easy. It didn't come as a single sweeping act, but in small choices made again and again, choosing peace instead of bitterness, choosing to release instead of holding on. I forgave my children for the careless words, for the distance, for the times they did not see me. I forgave myself, too, for all the years I gave without boundary, for the tears I swallowed, for the dignity I almost forgot I had. In forgiving, I realized I wasn't excusing what happened. I was simply setting myself free. Savannah had given me that gift. This little corner of the South became more than a town. It became my refuge, my second birth. Through the haven, I had found a way to turn sorrow into seeds of connection, and slowly, a community grew. Strangers had become companions. My granddaughter Ellie had become my anchor of laughter and light. Even Daniel and Tina, in their imperfect ways, had begun to reach out again. Looking back, I no longer saw my story as one of abandonment, but as one of becoming. I thought of George Eliot's words, "It is never too late to be what you might have been." For years, I believed the best of me had already passed, buried in sacrifice and regret. But now I knew the truth. There was still room to begin, still space to bloom, still time to be. Her story, my story, was not about a woman who lost her family, but about a woman who found herself, and in finding herself, made room for love to return in a new and tender way. And that, I believe, is what life is really about. Not the endings we fear, but the beginnings we choose. As the sun climbed higher, Sophie joined me in the garden. She slipped her hand into mine, her smile quiet but full of meaning. Behind us, the house felt alive with voices from the community people arriving for another gathering at the Haven. Laughter floated through the windows, mingling with the smell of fresh bread and the faint hum of a guitar. I realized then, I was no longer living in the shadow of what I had lost. I was living in the presence of what I had created. A home, a circle, a story worth telling. And so, if you are listening to this now, if you are carrying your own heartbreak, I want you to remember this. Your story isn't over. You are not too late. Dignity, love, forgiveness, they are all still within reach. If my journey has shown me anything, it is this. What truly belongs to us can never be taken, and what is meant for us will always find its way back, in one form or another. This is not just my story. This is her story, and perhaps it can be yours too. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts below. What part of my journey speaks to you most deeply? What story from your own life wants to be heard? By commenting, liking, and sharing, you are not just supporting this channel, you are keeping these stories alive, stories of resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of forgiveness. Because in the end, our stories aren't just for us. They are gifts we leave behind, like candles glowing on a windowsill, guiding someone else through the dark. And so I leave you with this truth, the one I carry like a prayer. It is never too late to be what you might have been.